Most people never lose because they lack intelligence. They lose because they were trained since childhood to prioritize being liked over being effective, and that training is so deep, so thoroughly embedded into how they speak, how they move, how they respond under pressure, that most of them never even identify it as a strategy someone else installed in them. They just call it being a good person. They call it being mature. They call it not causing problems. What they don't call it, what they never call it, is what it actually is, a behavioral pattern that keeps them predictable, manageable, and infinitely easier for strategic people to work around. Being liked and being respected are not the same thing. They are not even close to the same thing, and a man who confuses them does not simply miss out on influence. He quietly hands the entire frame of every interaction he participates in to whoever decided long ago that being liked was never the goal. Machiavelli understood this with the kind of clarity that made powerful people deeply uncomfortable. He watched courts full of talented, virtuous, well-intentioned men get dismantled, not by enemies more powerful than them, not by circumstances outside their control, but by their own compulsive need to be seen as good, their own inability to separate what a situation required from what would generate the most approval in the room, their own reflexive smoothing over of tensions that, left alone, would have revealed exactly who around them was actually trustworthy and who was not. He wrote the instruction manual for the man who was finally ready to see the game as it actually existed rather than the version he had been told it was. What follows is built on that foundation. 7 structural shifts that move you from operating on approval to operating on strategy. 7 upgrades in how you think, how you position yourself, how you manage energy and perception. None of this requires aggression. None of it requires hostility. It requires something far more demanding than either of those. It requires the discipline to play dumb when the room expects you to perform, and to move quietly while everyone else is busy announcing their intelligence. First, tolerance for tension is the foundation of leverage. There is a habit so deeply wired into most people that they perform it without any conscious awareness at all. The moment an interaction becomes even slightly uncomfortable, the moment tension rises, silence stretches, or disagreement enters the air, they move immediately to neutralize it. They laugh to release pressure. They overclarify to eliminate ambiguity. They apologize for positions that required no apology. They soften statements that needed to land exactly as hard as they were intended to land. They do all of this automatically, instinctively, because somewhere early in their development they learned that friction was dangerous and harmony was safe. That lesson was useful in certain contexts. In strategic contexts, it is the single most reliable way to signal that you can be managed. Here is what that reflexive tension avoidance actually communicates to everyone in the room who is paying close attention. It communicates that your comfort depends on the emotional weather of the environment, that you need things to feel smooth to feel stable, that when pressure arrives, your instinct is to relieve it rather than remain inside it long enough to let it do what it is there to do. And the people who are watching for exactly that signal, the ones who know how to read behavioral tells, file that information away and use it, not necessarily in an aggressive, deliberate way, sometimes simply by understanding that you can be redirected with mild social pressure, and then applying mild social pressure whenever it serves them. The structural shift here is to retrain your relationship with tension from something to be escaped to something to be inhabited deliberately. When friction enters an interaction, the strategic individual does not scramble to remove it. He allows it to exist. He holds steady inside it without visible discomfort, and in doing so, he forces the other person to recalibrate, because most people, when the tension they introduced does not produce the scrambling they expected, begin to second-guess their own position. They begin to wonder whether they misread the situation. They begin to adjust. The person who did not flinch becomes the person who, without saying a single additional word, just shifted the balance of the exchange simply by refusing to perform the expected retreat. This is not aggression. This is composure. And composure under pressure is one of the most readable signals of genuine authority that exists. Second, the moment you stop needing approval, you become unmanageable. Approval is the mechanism through which most social influence operates, not overt coercion, not obvious manipulation. Approval, the subtle, continuous adjustment of behavior to match what the room will reward with positive response. Watch how often the average person scans faces after making a statement. Watch how quickly they modify their tone when they sense mild resistance. Watch how they shrink a position the moment someone important in the room does not immediately agree with it. None of this looks like weakness on the surface. It looks like social intelligence, like reading the room, like adaptability. But what it actually is, underneath all the polite framing, is a chronic subordination of your own positioning to other people's momentary emotional reactions. The trap is that it works in the short term. Adjusting for approval keeps interaction smooth. It keeps rooms comfortable. It generates nods and smiles and the warm social friction of being generally well-liked. But every adjustment made in service of that immediate approval comes with a cost that is not immediately visible. It comes with the cost of having trained the people around you to expect that your positions are negotiable, your standards are flexible, and that the right amount of social pressure applied at the right moment will produce the modification they need. That expectation, once established, operates continuously. And the person who has trained others to expect adjustability has quietly made themselves adjustable on demand, which is the furthest possible position from genuine influence. Detaching from immediate approval does not mean becoming indifferent to how you are perceived. It means extending the timeline over which you evaluate that perception. The strategic individual is not asking whether this room approves of this statement right now. He is asking whether this interaction is building the kind of long-term positioning that serves his actual objectives. Those two questions produce fundamentally different behavior. The first produces a person who smooths things over. The second produces a person who occasionally creates brief discomfort in service of a much larger and more durable outcome. And the person who can do that, who can tolerate the short-term friction of not being immediately approved, is the person who gradually, quietly, accumulates the kind of authority that does not require constant maintenance because it was built correctly from the beginning. Third, controlling tempo means controlling the frame. The widespread assumption is that fast responses signal intelligence and decisiveness. In certain narrow contexts, that may be partially true. In most strategic contexts, it is exactly backwards. The person who responds instantly to every challenge, every provocation, every statement that lands with any emotional weight, is not demonstrating intelligence. They are demonstrating that they are operating on reflex rather than on strategy. And reflex is visible. It shows where you can be moved. It shows which levers, when pulled, produce immediate and predictable outputs. That visibility is a structural weakness that anyone paying attention can exploit without ever doing anything that could be called an attack. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the commander who understood tempo, who understood that controlling the pace of an engagement was itself a form of control. Often more decisive than any individual tactical move, the principle translates directly to social and professional dynamics. When you introduce deliberate delay into your responses, you accomplish several things at once. You give yourself the actual time needed to assess what is happening beneath the surface of an exchange, which is almost always different from what is being presented on the surface. You create uncertainty in the other person, who expected a faster response and now has to sit with the ambiguity of not knowing what your delay means, and you demonstrate, through the simple act of not being rushed, that you are operating from a place of internal stability rather than reactive urgency. That demonstration shifts the perceived balance of an interaction more reliably than almost anything that could be said. The practical discipline here is uncomfortable at first because it requires tolerating the internal pressure that builds when a situation seems to demand immediate response. Most people experience that pressure as almost physical, an urgency to speak, to clarify, to move, learning, To sit inside that pressure without discharging it is a trainable capacity. Every time you pause before responding in a low-stakes situation, you build the architecture for pausing in high-stakes situations. Every time you let silence stretch a few seconds longer than feels comfortable, you expand your tolerance for the kind of unresolved tension that strategic interactions are frequently built inside. The person who has developed this capacity becomes genuinely difficult to rush, difficult to provoke into premature disclosure, and difficult to steer through the kind of artificial urgency that is one of the oldest and most reliable tools in the manipulation toolkit. Fourth, indiscriminate generosity destroys value. The principle that kindness should be constant, that patience should be unlimited, that generosity should be extended equally to everyone regardless of their behavior. This sounds like a moral position. It is, in practice, a strategic liability. When your time, your attention, your energy, and your support are available to anyone who requests them without conditions, without evaluation, without any signal that they might be withdrawn if the recipient behaves badly, they lose the property that makes them valuable. Scarcity is what gives anything weight, and the person who has eliminated all scarcity from their generosity has also eliminated all weight from it. Watch how people treat what they know they can always have. They do not treat it carefully. They do not think twice before consuming it. They do not experience gratitude the way people experience gratitude for things that were not guaranteed. They experience something closer to expectation, the quiet, unexamined assumption that this resource will continue to be available regardless of how they treat it or the person providing it. And once that expectation is established, the dynamic it creates is one where the generous person's generosity is taken entirely for granted, where crossing lines carries no real cost, and where the relationship is structured permanently around one person providing and the other receiving without any pressure toward reciprocity. Selective generosity restructures this entirely. When your encouragement is intentional rather than automatic, it becomes something worth earning. When your patience is conditional, available to people who demonstrate respect for it, withdrawn from people who repeatedly abuse it, it becomes a signal that something real is at stake in how you are treated. When your investment of time and attention is reserved for people who are genuinely aligned with your standards and contributing something of real value to the exchange, it communicates a fact about you that unlimited availability could never communicate, that you have evaluated this person and this situation and decided they are worth investing in, which is a qualitatively different thing from simply being available to everyone by default. The person who receives the first kind of generosity has received a discount. The person who receives the second has received a genuine signal of value. The psychological impact of those two things is entirely different. One is taken for granted. The other is protected. Fifth, mystery is leverage. Stop explaining yourself. The compulsive need to be fully understood, to ensure that no one walks away from an interaction with a misimpression, that every statement is clarified until its meaning is unambiguous, that every decision is explained thoroughly enough that its reasoning cannot be questioned. This pattern feels like intellectual integrity. What it actually is a chronic overinvestment in other people's perception management that strips away one of the most powerful assets available to any individual. Operating in a social or professional environment, mystery, the simple, durable power that comes from not being completely readable. When you explain everything, you give people a complete map of your reasoning, and a complete map is a tactical gift to anyone who wants to find the gaps in your logic, identify the values you are most attached to, or construct an argument specifically designed to move you. Every full explanation is a complete picture of how you got somewhere, which means it is also a picture of how you can be redirected away from there. The person who consistently over-explains in an attempt to ensure understanding is, in practice, consistently providing the information needed to anticipate and counteract their next move. That is not a small cost. In any environment where positioning matters, it is the cost of operating with your strategy completely visible at all times. The structural shift here requires tolerating the discomfort of ambiguity, both the ambiguity you create in others and the ambiguity you have to sit with yourself. When someone looks uncertain after you speak and you feel the pull to clarify, that pull is worth examining. Is the clarification genuinely necessary for a useful outcome, or is it driven by the need to ensure that this particular person has a positive impression of your reasoning? Those are different motivations, and they produce different decisions. The strategic individual speaks with enough clarity to accomplish what the moment requires, and then stops. He does not elaborate to eliminate all possible misinterpretation. He does not follow up to ensure receipt. He allows his statement to land where it lands and trusts that the positioning he has built over time will provide the context that excessive explanation could never provide as effectively. Concision is not coldness. It is the mark of a person who understands that words are not free, that every additional sentence is another window into your reasoning, and that some windows are better kept closed. Sixth, every interaction adjusts the balance. Start noticing. Status is not decided in dramatic confrontations. It is not established in meetings where the stakes are obvious and everyone is aware that something important is being negotiated. It is constructed in the accumulation of ordinary moments, small interactions, brief exchanges, micro-decisions about who adjusts and who holds, who invests more effort and who receives more than they put in. By the time a significant imbalance has developed between two people, it has almost always been built through a long series of individually insignificant moments that no one was tracking carefully enough to address. The shift here is to begin tracking them, not obsessively, not with paranoia, but with the basic awareness that interactions are not neutral. They are exchanges, and exchanges have balances. When you consistently do more explaining than the other person, more accommodating, more adjusting of your position in the direction of their comfort, you are consistently depositing more into the exchange than you are receiving. That imbalance, over time, creates a hierarchy, one where your effort signals need, and need signals that the other person holds more of the leverage. The person who learns to read this dynamic early, before it is calcified into a fixed pattern, can recalibrate at the point where recalibration is still subtle enough to be natural. The person who only notices it after years have passed has a much harder correction to make. Recalibration does not require confrontation. It rarely benefits from it. When you notice that an exchange has become consistently lopsided in someone else's favor, the strategic response is not to address the imbalance directly in a way that creates drama. It is to quietly reduce your overinvestment, speak a little less, explain a little less, be a little less immediately available. Let your reduced investment show up as a pattern of behavior rather than as a single dramatic change of posture. Most people will not consciously notice what shifted, but they will notice the effect. The interaction will feel different to them, slightly less comfortable in a way they cannot immediately identify, and that shift in comfort level is often exactly what is needed to restore a more honest balance. Seventh, your reputation is not what happens to you, it is what you build. Most people relate to reputation passively. They move through environments hoping that their intentions are visible, that their actual character will eventually communicate itself through some kind of osmotic process, that if they simply behave well and work hard and treat people decently, the right impression will accumulate without any deliberate effort on their part. This is not how reputation works. Reputation is not the honest distillation of a person's genuine character over time. It is the accumulation of whatever impressions have been formed by whatever behaviors were most visible to whatever audiences were most influential, and most of those impressions are formed in brief, somewhat accidental moments, in how a person responded under pressure one afternoon, in what they tolerated publicly on one occasion, in how they behaved when they believed the most important people in the room were not paying attention. Machiavelli's core insight on this is one of the most practically useful things ever written about social positioning. He observed that people respond far more powerfully to demonstrations than to explanations. What you do in a visible moment, particularly a moment under pressure, carries more reputational weight than anything you could ever say about yourself in a calm conversation. The person who remains steady in a moment when everyone expected reactivity has just demonstrated something that no self-description could have communicated. The person who enforces a standard calmly when it would have been far easier to let it pass has established the existence of that standard more credibly than any amount of prior discussion. Reputation is built from these demonstrations, accumulated over time, in the way that interest compounds, slowly at first, and then in a way that becomes difficult to reverse. Designing reputation intentionally means thinking a level above the moment, before responding to a challenging situation, asking not just what response this moment requires, but what this response will teach the people watching about who you are and how you operate. Before tolerating something, asking not just whether you can live with this specific instance, but what pattern you are establishing by tolerating it. Before explaining yourself at length in a moment when brevity would be more powerful, asking whether the explanation serves the interaction or serves your own need to be understood, and whether those two things are actually the same in this case. These are not complex questions. They are simply a different layer of consideration than the one most people are operating on, which is almost entirely reactive, responding to what just happened rather than building toward what comes next. The person who operates with this level of intentionality about their own positioning is, over time, almost unrecognizable compared to the person who is simply reacting to whatever each day presents, not because they have changed dramatically, but because every small decision has been made with an awareness of what it contributes to a larger architecture, and that architecture, a reputation for steadiness, for enforced standards, for composure under pressure, for the kind of authority that does not require announcement, becomes a structural asset that operates continuously in the background of every interaction, lowering friction, elevating positioning, and doing work on your behalf in rooms you are not even present. What you have just moved through is not a collection of separate tactics. It is a single integrated framework for operating in any social or professional environment at a higher level of strategic awareness than most people ever develop. Each of the 7 shifts connects to the others and amplifies them. The person who has developed tolerance for tension is naturally less dependent on immediate approval, because they no longer need the room to feel comfortable to feel stable. The person who has detached from immediate approval naturally develops better tempo control, because they are no longer being rushed by the anxiety of an unresolved social situation. The person with better tempo control naturally delivers their generosity more selectively, because they are not operating on reflex. The person with selective generosity naturally withholds more closure, because they are not scrambling to ensure everyone feels good about the interaction. The person who withholds closure naturally becomes more aware of interaction dynamics, because they are operating with more observation and less performance, and the person who manages interaction dynamics consciously is constantly, continuously, building their reputation with intention rather than leaving it to chance. Machiavelli's insight that most people today still resist is that intelligence without positioning is not sufficient. Good intentions without strategic awareness are not sufficient. Talent without an understanding of how perception works is not sufficient. The world does not reward the person with the best internal qualities. It responds to what is demonstrated, what is projected, and what is consistently enforced through behavioral patterns over time. That is not a cynical conclusion. It is simply an accurate description of how influence actually forms in human environments. Stripped of the comfortable fictions people prefer about how merit automatically surfaces and virtue is always eventually recognized, the man who understands this, who stops waiting for the world to correctly assess him and starts deliberately shaping what there is to assess, is the most dangerous kind of person in any room, not because he is aggressive, not because he is manipulative, because he is doing something almost everyone else is not doing. He is playing the game that is actually being played rather than the game he was told was being played. And the gap between those two games is where every significant outcome is decided. Stop acting nice to survive. Start playing smart to build. The entire dynamic shifts the moment you understand that these are not the same thing and never were. What most people do with this information. There is a predictable pattern in how most people respond to a framework like this. They listen carefully. They feel the recognition, the specific sensation of seeing something described accurately that they have experienced but never been able to name. They walk away with genuine intention to apply it, and then, within 24 hours, under the first real moment of social pressure, they revert entirely to the old pattern. Not because they forgot the content, because the old pattern is not just a habit. It is a nervous system response that was built through years of repetition and reinforcement, and one session of intellectual clarity is not sufficient to override it. The gap between understanding a principle and actually operating from it under pressure is one of the most consistently underestimated distances in human development. Most people assume the gap is primarily cognitive, that if they understand the idea clearly enough, the behavior will follow, but behavior under pressure is not primarily cognitive. It is neurological. It runs on the pathways that have been traveled most frequently, and a pathway that says smooth things over, adjust, explain yourself, retreat from tension. That pathway in most people is an expressway, deep, wide, traveled thousands of times. The new pathway, hold steady, delay the response, allow the discomfort, move from strategy rather than reflex, is a dirt road at best, and dirt roads do not become highways from a single trip down them. What changes behavior under pressure is not understanding. It is repetition of the new response in low-stakes situations until that response becomes the default. Every time you allow a small tension to exist without rushing to relieve it, you are resurfacing the road. Every time you pause before responding in a conversation that doesn't matter very much, you are practicing the pause for the conversation that matters enormously. Every time you withdraw a small piece of overinvestment from an interaction that doesn't require it, you are training the capacity for the withdrawal that will eventually recalibrate something significant. The framework is the map, the repetition is the travel, and the travel is the only thing that actually gets you somewhere different from where you already are. So the question at the end of this is not whether you found this useful. The question is what you do in the next interaction that would previously have produced the old pattern, because that moment, that specific moment of pressure where the reflex presents itself and you have a fraction of a second to choose between the road you know and the road you are building, that moment is where everything either stays the same or begins, quietly and without announcement, to shift. Nice is a comfort strategy. Strategy is a positioning system. They are not in conflict, but they are not the same. And the man who finally understands the difference between them and begins, one interaction at a time, to act from that understanding, is the man who stops being surprised by outcomes and starts being the primary architect of them. Play dumb long enough to understand everything. Move only when the moment is yours. That is not weakness dressed up as strategy. That is strategy dressed down as ordinary. And ordinary is the most underestimated position a dangerous person can occupy.